I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at John F. Kennedy. In this particular discussion, we'll be looking at the election of 1960. He took on Richard Nixon. We'll look at some of Kennedy's domestic policies, and we'll assess the impact of the Kennedy assassination. All right, so when we look at this particular section, we'll be looking at some of the background first on the Kennedy who ran in 1960. We'll be looking at Richard Nixon versus John F. Kennedy, two very famous Americans. We look here at the background of Kennedy versus that of Nixon, kind of a bit of a difference here in terms of their background, in terms of where they came from and their wealth, but generally speaking, they're very similar candidates in terms of age and experience. In fact, you could probably argue Nixon was a little more experienced than Kennedy. All right, so we look at the background. Kennedy's from a very wealthy family. He was a person in family of privilege. Didn't really have to worry about anything. He became the first Roman Catholic president elected. First Roman Catholic president elected. There's been two. Joe Biden was elected president in 2020. Kennedy was born in 1917, and at 43 years of age, he's the youngest elected president. That's because Theodore Roosevelt was slightly younger when he became president of the United States after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. In addition to serving in the United States Navy, Kennedy was an author, wrote several books, and he was a senator from the state of Massachusetts, and of course he was a Democrat. Richard Nixon, he was from a middle-class California family. He grew up in Whittier, California. He was a Quaker, born in 1913, and he was 47 years of age. He too served in the Navy, so you can see another similar trait between the two candidates. He was an influential member of the House of Representatives. He served on the HUAC Committee, the House and Un-American Activities Committee. He was a staunch anti-communist, kind of a Cold War warrior. He had brought accused communists in front of the House of Reps Committee, the HUAC Committee, and grilled them very strongly. And he went from an obscure congressional member to somebody who most Americans across the country knew. He too is a senator, U.S. Senator from California, Republican, and he was the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. So that experience as vice president, of course, gave him a little bit more experience than that of John F. Kennedy. This election would be impacted greatly by the presidential debates. There's some links on my Bitmoji Classroom to some really good video clips on the debate to kind of give the differences between the two. It was the very first presidential debate that was televised between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, televised on September 26, 1960. Over 70 million people in the country watched. It was one of the highest rated individual programs in the history of TV to that date. And you can see here they had kind of an interesting little parody here on the debate. So usually when this is kind of like what you would see is like a boxing poster that you might see in contemporary times or any point in time in boxing history. So they nicknamed Richard Nixon, Dickie Nixon, the Whittier Flash, as I mentioned before, that's where he's from. Jackie Kennedy, which is kind of an unusual nickname for John F. Kennedy since his wife's name is Jackie. In the case of Kennedy, he's the Cape Cod Wizard, I think. And it said 65 million rounds. And, obviously, that's much longer than a normal boxing match, which is usually maybe 15 rounds tops. The case here is 65 million. Think about what that might represent. That was the expected number of Americans who would watch the debate. And of course, we know that that number was higher than that even when the actual debate took place. And then usually a boxing has like the main event, which would be Nixon versus Kennedy. And then the undercard would be like a lesser boxing matches between the Republican vice presidential nominee Lodge and the Democratic vice presidential nominee Johnson, or LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. It has the date and the place of where the debate will take place. The date of the date is election day, and then of course the Bill Water Stadium is a particular site in Los Angeles. How did the public opinion on who won the 1960 debate vary between those who watched the debate on TV versus those who listened to it on the radio? If you look at the photographs there, you might be able to see some of the staunch differences between the two candidates. JFK appeared healthy, strong. Nixon appeared tired, ill, frazzled. On appearances, John F. Kennedy won the debate. So if you didn't even hear any of the words right now, and you're just looking at that photograph, you might just think that John F. Kennedy won the debate just based on the way he looked. Nixon's kind of very stiff looking there, kind of like sitting a little bit overly upright. There's a lot of different things you might notice about these photographs. We may look at it a little more closely in an activity in class. So I don't want to break the debate down too much in my initial discussions here. Kind of leave it up to you to kind of take in the imagery. Those who listened to the debate on the radio actually thought Nixon won based on his responses to the debate questions. On policy, positions, and debating skills, Nixon won the debate. But based on the picture, the images that people saw at home on their television screen, and you may be familiar, and I assume you are, with the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case here, that turned out to be very true for John F. Kennedy. 5, besides the debate, how did the TV era impact the campaign? For the first time, candidates were spending large sums of political money on political commercials, both on TV and radio. Democrats spending around $6 million, Republicans around $7.5 million. The 2020 presidential election saw well over $1 billion spent on the election, so quite an increase. Anytime you have an election, there's some themes that'll kind of emerge. In the case of this particular election, you can probably guess some of the major themes. Obviously, the Cold War remains this central issue in the United States in the 1960s. The missile gap, there was a race to see which country, the United States or the Soviet Union, would stockpile more weapons of mass destruction. The space race, obviously we saw the very first major event go the way of the Soviet Union with Sputnik, the first satellite launched into outer space. That too led to a change in American policy in regard to education in the country, with an emphasis now on mathematics and science. Civil rights movement, economic issues, obviously religion would become an issue. Obviously, many Americans were hesitant to elect a Catholic president. And then in Cuba, in 1959, Fidel Castro came to power, installing a communist government with close ties to the Soviet Union. And with Cuba being just 75 miles or 90 miles or so off of the Florida coast, this would be a direct threat to American security if there was a strong alliance between Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, and Castro, the Cuban leader. Question 7, list the factors that a president may consider when choosing a vice presidential running mate. Why was Johnson a great choice for Kennedy? Some of the things that a candidate looks to do is to kind of balance out the ticket. If you have like a really old candidate from, let's say, the Northeast, well, you don't want another old candidate from the Northeast. You want to balance it out geographically, age-wise, or experience-wise. If you have a particular weakness, you may want to balance that out. So in the case of Kennedy, he's from Massachusetts, very liberal area of the country. Kennedy is very inexperienced, very young. So Lyndon Johnson was perhaps the most experienced politician in the U.S. Senate. He was the Senate Majority Leader, meaning the highest ranking senator of the senators in the country. He was from Texas, so a much more conservative area in the Southwest versus the Northeast. This balanced out the ticket, giving a youthful JFK from a liberal state of Massachusetts with a much more conservative and much more experienced Lyndon Johnson. What were the results of the 1960 election? And you can see it there on the electoral map. You can see in the blue would be the states that Kennedy won. You can see in the states that are in the red, which are the states that Nixon won. In the purplish color is the state of Mississippi. They ran a segregationist candidate, and Harry Byrd ended up winning Mississippi, which was perhaps the most segregated state in the United States by this time. I would say that, along with Alabama. So John F. Kennedy, he and Vice President Johnson defeated Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon and VP Henry Lodge by about 120,000 popular votes. Very narrow victory out of 68 million votes cast, and won the Electoral College around 303 to 219. 9. Why did the American public embrace Kennedy? His youth, optimism for the nation captivated many Americans. JFK also reacted quickly to events on the ground, such as Martin Luther King being arrested, while Nixon had a much more hands-off approach, really not engaging on the issues at the time. Kennedy's actions helped him garner the support of the African American community, which many historians kind of attribute to his narrow victory margin, especially in some of the big cities like Chicago. He narrowly carried Illinois. Why was John F. Kennedy's New Frontier a great name for his agenda? Now, keep in mind, many presidents have nicknames for their agenda. For example, Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. We'll look at Lyndon Johnson's presidency upcoming, the Great Society. All right, so when you look at his agenda, which was the New Frontier, a very ambitious agenda, both in international relations as well as on the home front. And one of the key things he indicated he wanted to do is the American space program was to put the first man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. So when you think about the New Frontier, nothing would be newer than going to the moon. So he wanted to strengthen and improve the economy. He would deal with civil rights issues, educational issues, the space program, as we mentioned, the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps would be a great program where young people, either recent graduates from high school or college, would volunteer. Usually it was college graduates, and if you went there with some background in medicine or education, infrastructure, you volunteer time for a period, usually a period of time of about a year, 18 months. And we go there and help out in that country to try and lift it out of the third world status and out of poverty and into a much more modern situation. Here's a quote from Kennedy. We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges. So we look at Kennedy, compare the New Frontier Initiative with the Western frontier of the American pioneers. We call the issues in the 1960s the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. This, of course, appealed to people's national pride, the determination of America to conquer obstacles and take advantage of new opportunities. Anytime a president's elected, one of the things they need to do is to put together a strong cabinet. When you look here, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, this is his younger brother. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and somebody who really helped to craft some of the main ideas that came out of the Kennedy administration was the spokesperson, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a great writer in history. Here's some photographs here. Obviously, Kennedy, this is his cabinet here. Lyndon Johnson here. In addition to that, you can see Secretary of Defense McNamara, Dean Rusk, John F. Kennedy's younger brother Bobby. Why did Kennedy struggle to get his New Frontier programs passed in Congress? Well, Kennedy had won just shy of 50% of the popular vote, like 49.8% or something along those lines. Many congressional members felt like the country did not really support him. And as a result of that, others felt that the social programs were too costly. 14, why did the need for the Equal Pay Act say about equality? I'm recording a lesson for the next 20 minutes, so.
I wanted to say hello because I won't see you.
I don't need you to speak on my lesson. Thank you.
They might like the lesson then.
Thank you, Miss W. Please leave. Thank you. All right, sorry about that interruption. Sometimes teachers step in the room as I'm trying to record one of our lessons here. 14, what did the need for the Equal Pay Act say about equality in the United States at this time? The need for the Equal Pay Act shows the country had still not achieved equality for all citizens. In addition to African Americans not being treated equally, women were not being treated equally in that they were receiving lower pay than men for doing the same work. 15, explain John F. Kennedy's economic policy, and was it effective? John F. Kennedy proposed tax credits for businesses and increased military spending. He also used deficit spending to stimulate the economy. He borrowed money from other countries to reduce taxes on American citizens. He also increased taxes on wealthier citizens. These policies resulted in tremendous economic growth in the 1960s. 16, why was Kennedy cautious about supporting civil rights at the very start of his presidency? Well, at first, Kennedy was really hesitant. He didn't want to anger some of the conservative Democrats who might support some of his policies in Congress. However, as time would go on and more of the civil rights movement played out on TV, and Kennedy knew that these actions were heinous. He was seeing them with his own eyes. The action of white Southerners against African American protesters convinced him that he needed to more strongly support civil rights and more actively send in help for those who were struggling. '17, how did the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union lead to the space race? Cite specific events and explain some of their interactions. Well, the launch, obviously, of Sputnik 1 in 1957 scared many Americans and brought the competitive nature out. Americans do not like to lose, and as a result, we really stepped up our program. The United States began to improve its technology with Project Mercury, which inspired Kennedy to give greater support to NASA. Because of NASA, the United States was able to keep up with and eventually overtake the Soviets in the space race. The United States put a man into space and a man on the moon. The Kennedy Space Center, which is located in Cape Canaveral, Florida, along the Atlantic coast there, along the east coast of Florida. It's a great spot to visit if you ever have an opportunity. It's maybe a half-hour drive from Orlando, so if your family's ever out in that way in the Disney area, maybe you can twist their arm and have you go take a look. I took my children there maybe about 5 years ago. It's really a nice addition to our Disney trip. This photograph here is from the museum there. They have a wide variety of different things, including this imagery here of John Glenn, who was the very first American to orbit the Earth in 1962. first man on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Planted the flag. One of the most dramatic events in the history of the world in July 1969. Ironically enough, the person that Kennedy defeated for the presidency in 1960 would be the president of the United States in July of 1969 to share in the credit for putting the first man on the moon. That was Richard Nixon. 20, how did the moon landing impact the space race? It was a turning point in the space race, as never again, never would the Soviet Union rival the United States for supremacy in space. Today we do cooperate with what is today Russia on the International Space Station. Now we're going to look at one of the saddest events in American history. Why was President Kennedy in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963? He was attempting to prove his support in Texas for his re-election campaign in 1964. He was riding in a convertible car during a parade in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. You can see here, this is the car he was riding in. That's Governor Connolly, the governor of Texas. That's Jackie Kennedy and John F. Kennedy's wife. That's obviously Kennedy. This is Secret Service here and a driver. It's Mrs. Connolly here. And the assassination took place. Lee Harvey Oswald was positioned in a Dallas book depository, a warehouse. And from one of the elevated levels of the floor there, he positioned himself with a sniper rifle. And one of the shots actually went through Governor Connolly's collarbone here, broke his collarbone, and actually hit Kennedy. That was one of the shots that hit Kennedy, and then the kill shot hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. So very sad indeed. This is in the newspapers from across the country and around the world. One of the most devastating events in history. If you have a grandparent, you could probably ask them where they were. I'm sure they know exactly when they found out about it. My mom was in phys ed class. My father was in the armed forces at the time. Lee Harvey Oswald was the assassin. Before we could really get to interview him and really get his testimony and put him on trial, he was actually murdered in Dallas inside the police station, contributing to additional conspiracy theories. How a random private citizen got that close to the person who assassinated the president of the United States is one of the biggest questions in history. You notice one of the detectives on the left there with the hat on. He's actually lurching away instead of towards the gunman, which is kind of surprising. You see Oswald in the center picture there getting shot and killed by Jack Ruby, who was a Dallas nightclub owner who was really distraught by the Kennedy assassination. So many conspiracy theories kind of broke out in the aftermath. So conspiracy theories, it's up to you to kind of determine which one you think might be most plausible. Some believe the Soviet Union was behind it, or Cuba, both of whom were communist and disliked our country. The United States had tried to kill Castro multiple times, so some people believe Castro sought revenge. The mob, as the Kennedy administration was cracking down on the mob, there's also allegations that John F. Kennedy had an affair with one of the mob members' girlfriends. Lyndon Johnson, who most directly benefited from the assassination by becoming president. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI and had some issues with the Kennedy family. So a lot of different conspiracy theories are around. To dispel some of these conspiracy theories and get to the bottom of what happened, the United States created the Warren Commission, chaired by the Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. Many political leaders from the House of Reps and Senate were given the task of investigating the Kennedy assassination. After much research, they concluded that Oswald had acted alone. 25, how did television impact the Kennedy presidency? Well, we had mentioned earlier that TV had helped to directly elect him. Kennedy's charm came through in the televised debates. Television and media also helped the rest of the country, including Kennedy, understand and sympathize with people battling racial discrimination. Finally, Kennedy's funeral was televised, contributing to the sense of sadness felt by the entire country. Lesson reflection, the text stated that Kennedy was killed. It seemed as if part of America's innocence had died with him. What details may support this? Well, because Kennedy spoke so eloquently about the need to move towards a more peaceful future, a lot of Americans related to him. He was very inspirational. He had noble dreams. When he was killed, many people reacted as if they had lost a member of their own family. Part of America's innocence died with Kennedy. We don't often get a leader who is as popular and forward-looking as Kennedy. And he gave Americans hope and optimism. When he died, many people lost hope. Hopefully, you enjoyed our discussion on the Kennedy administration. Until next time, Mr. Clarke and Miss W, our special guest, are out.